There are moments in life that arrive without warning. Moments that split your existence into before and after. For Melina, that moment came on a dusty roadside on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when the world as she knew it cracked open to reveal something she could never have imagined. But let me start at the beginning. Melina was a fabric vendor. Not the kind you'd find in a fancy boutique with silk curtains and perfumed air. No, Melina's shop was modest. A small storefront where she sold cotton, linen, and occasionally, if she was lucky, a bolt of patterned cloth that would catch the afternoon light just right. Her hands were rough from years of measuring and cutting. Her back bent from carrying bundles to and from the market. She lived alone. Not because she wanted to, but because life had simply unfolded that way. There had been dreams once, of a husband, of children running through a courtyard, of laughter echoing off walls. But those dreams had faded like old fabric left too long in the sun, their colors bleeding out until only the memory of brightness remained. Most evenings, Melina would close her shop, walk the familiar path home, heat up yesterday's leftovers, and sit by her window watching the village settle into darkness. It wasn't a sad life. It was simply quiet. The kind of quiet that feels safe because it asks nothing of you. On that particular Tuesday, Melina was returning from a supplier 3 villages away. She'd secured a good price on some beautiful indigo fabric, the kind that would sell well, and her mind was already calculating profits, thinking about which customers might be interested. The road home wound through sparse countryside, past fields that had seen better rains and trees that offered patches of shade to weary travelers. That's when she saw them. First, it was just a shape on the roadside. The sun was lowering, casting long shadows, and Melina almost drove past. Almost. But something made her slow down. Some instinct she didn't know she possessed whispered, "Look. Really look." There, beneath a withered acacia tree, sat a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 years old. His clothes were little more than rags, his feet bare and dusty. But it wasn't the boy himself that made Melina's heart stop. It was what he held in his arms. 2 babies. Tiny, fragile things wrapped in cloths that had once been white, but were now the color of earth and desperation. The boy was trying to shade them from the sun with his own small body, his face etched with an expression no child should ever wear. The look of someone carrying the weight of the entire world. Melina's foot hit the brake before her mind could catch up. She sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, her sensible mind warring with something deeper, something that felt like it was cracking open inside her chest. "Drive on," the sensible voice said. "This isn't your problem. You don't know these children. You don't know their story. Getting involved will only bring complications." But there was another voice. Quieter. Older. The voice that remembered what it felt like to be alone, to be overlooked, to be the person everyone walks past. Melina turned off the engine. When she approached, the boy looked up at her with eyes that held far too much knowledge. Eyes that had seen things children should never witness. He didn't speak. Didn't beg. He simply watched her, his arms tightening protectively around the babies. "Hello," Melina said softly, crouching down to his level. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in days. "Quito." "Quito," Melina repeated. "And these babies?" "My brother and sister." His chin lifted slightly, defiant despite the obvious hopelessness of his situation. "I'm taking care of them." Melina looked at the twins more closely. They couldn't have been more than a few months old. Their little faces were dirty, their breathing shallow. One of them, a girl Melina thought, had her tiny hand curled around Quito's finger, holding on as if that grip was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "How long have you been out here?" Melina asked. Quito's eyes dropped. 3 days. Maybe 4. I lost count. 3 days. In that heat. With 2 infants and no food, no water beyond what he could beg from passing travelers, most of whom had driven right by without stopping. The sensible voice in Melina's head grew quieter. The other voice, the one that recognized itself in this abandoned child, grew louder. "Have they eaten?" she asked. Quito shook his head. "A woman gave us some milk yesterday. But it's gone now." Melina felt something shift inside her. It wasn't a decision exactly. It was more like a recognition. like looking into a mirror and finally seeing clearly what had been there all along. "Come with me," she said, standing up and extending her hand. Quito stared at her hand as if it might disappear. "Where?" "Home. My home. You need food. The babies need care. And we can figure out the rest later." "But you don't know us." Melina smiled, and it was a sad smile, full of all the years she'd spent being invisible herself. "No. But I know what it's like to be alone. And I know that nobody should have to be alone like this. Especially not children." For a long moment, Quito didn't move. Melina could see the conflict playing across his young face, the desperate hope warring with learned distrust, the part of him that wanted so badly to believe in kindness fighting against everything that had taught him the world was cruel. Then slowly he reached out and took her hand. It was a small hand, a child's hand, but in that touch, Melina felt the entire trajectory of her life change direction. She didn't know it yet, not fully, but that simple act of reaching back would transform everything. Not just for her, not just for Quito and the twins, but for an entire village. Because sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the smallest gestures. Sometimes, changing the world starts with stopping your car on a dusty roadside and seeing what everyone else chose to ignore. Melina helped Quito to his feet, careful not to disturb the babies in his arms. She noticed how thin he was, how his legs shook slightly as he stood. How long had he been wandering? Where had he come from? Where were his parents? Questions for later, she told herself. Right now these children needed immediate care. She guided them to her small truck, opened the passenger door, and helped Quito climb in. He settled onto the seat, still cradling the twins with a care that spoke of practice, of weeks or maybe months of being their sole protector. As Melina started the engine and pulled back onto the road, she glanced over at her unexpected passengers. The boy was staring straight ahead, his jaw set in that way children hold themselves when they're trying very hard not to cry. One of the twins had started to whimper, a weak, kitten-like sound that tore at Melina's heart. "Almost there," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was comforting Quito or herself. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. In the fading light, Melina's house came into view. A modest structure, nothing special but solid and safe. Home. When she'd left that morning, it had been a house for one. A place of routine and quiet resignation. But as she pulled into the driveway with these 3 children beside her, something fundamental had already shifted. She could feel it in the air, in the rapid beating of her heart, in the way her hands trembled slightly as she turned off the engine. This was no longer just her house. This was about to become a home. This is Tales by RM, where we breathe new life into old stories, giving them new voices for hearts that need to hear them. If this story is touching something inside you, stay with us, because this is only the beginning. Inside the house, Melina moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She settled Quito and the babies on her worn sofa, the same sofa where she'd spent countless evenings alone, and suddenly it seemed to come alive with meaning. The twins were so small, so impossibly fragile. Their little bodies felt weightless in her arms as she carefully took them from Quito, one at a time. "When did they last have milk?" she asked gently. Quito's voice was barely a whisper. "Yesterday morning. A lady," she stopped. "She gave us some from a bottle. Yesterday morning. More than 24 hours ago." Melina's heart clenched. "Stay here," she said, handing the babies back to him. "Don't move. I'm going to get some things." She rushed to her kitchen. A simple space that had prepared meals for one for so many years, it had forgotten what it felt like to feed the hungry. She heated water, found an old bottle she'd kept from. She couldn't even remember why she'd kept it. Maybe for this moment. Maybe some part of her had always been waiting. She mixed formula she'd have to buy more of tomorrow, tested the temperature on her wrist the way she'd seen mothers do, and hurried back to the living room. Quito was sitting exactly where she'd left him, his eyes wide and watchful, as if he still couldn't quite believe this was happening. "Here," Melina said, kneeling beside him. "Let me show you." She took the baby girl first, the smaller of the two, and cradled her in the crook of her arm. The moment the bottle's nipple touched the infant's lips, the baby latched on with desperate urgency, her tiny hands coming up to grip the bottle as if afraid it might be taken away. Melina felt tears prick her eyes. She'd never held a baby before. Never fed one. Never felt that particular weight of a small life depending entirely on you. And yet, somehow, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When the girl had drunk her fill, Melina burped her gently, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence, and handed her to Quito while she fed the boy twin. He was slightly bigger, his cry stronger, but just as hungry, just as desperate. Quito watched everything with those ancient eyes of his. "You're good at this," he said quietly. Melina laughed, and it was a sound she barely recognized, lighter than she'd heard from herself in years. "I'm making it up as I go." "That's what I did too," Quito said. "For weeks. Just figuring it out." There it was. The confirmation of what Melina had suspected. This boy had been caring for these infants alone for weeks. Music shifts to something more melancholic. After both babies were fed and changed, Melina had to improvise with dish towels until she could buy proper diapers. She made Quito eat. She heated up soup, buttered bread, poured milk. She watched as he tried to eat slowly, tried to have manners, but his hunger won out. He ate like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in far too long. "When you're ready," Melina said softly, sitting across from him, "you can tell me what happened. But only when you're ready." Quito finished his second bowl of soup, wiped his mouth, looked down at his hands, and then in a voice that shook and paused and sometimes broke entirely, he told her the story. His mother had died giving birth to the twins. His father, a man Quito described with fear in his eyes, had looked at the newborn babies and seen only burden, only expense, only mouths he couldn't afford to feed. The man had been drinking more, working less, and his anger had grown like a poison. "He said they were cursed," Quito whispered. "He said mother died because of them. He said things that made me know I had to get them away." "So you ran," Melina said. "I took them in the night. I didn't know where to go. I just walked. I thought maybe someone in another village would help. But everyone looked at us like we were nothing." His voice broke on that last word. Nothing. As if 3 human lives could be reduced to nothing simply because they were inconvenient. Because they were vulnerable. Because they didn't fit into the neat categories of acceptable suffering. Melina reached across the table and took Quito's hand. "You're not nothing. You're here. You're alive. And you," her voice grew fierce, "you are the bravest person I've ever met. Do you understand me? 11 years old and you saved your brother and sister. You kept them alive for weeks. That's not nothing. That's everything." Quito's face crumpled. For the first time since Melina had found him, the mask of strength fell away and he was just a child. A terrified, exhausted, heartbroken child. He sobbed, great heaving sobs that shook his thin frame, and Melina moved around the table and pulled him into her arms. "You're safe now," she murmured into his hair. "All 3 of you. You're safe." She meant it. In that moment, holding this boy who had carried impossibly too much, Melina made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She didn't think about the logistics, didn't think about the judgment that would come, didn't think about how her quiet, predictable existence was about to be torn apart and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. She just knew with a certainty that felt like destiny that these children were hers now. Not by blood, not by law, but by something deeper than either of those things. By choice, by love, by the recognition that sometimes family isn't something you're born into. It's something you create out of courage and compassion and the radical decision to care. That first night was chaos. The twins woke every few hours crying for food, for comfort, for the reassurance that someone was there. Melina and Quito took turns, an unlikely team, this fabric vendor who'd never been a mother, and this child who'd been forced to become a parent before he'd finished being a kid. By dawn, Melina's house looked like a tornado had torn through it. Dishes in the sink. Makeshift diapers everywhere. The sofa turned into a bed for Quito, with the twins sleeping in a drawer she'd padded with blankets and placed on the floor beside him so he could watch over them. Melina sat in her kitchen as the sun rose, drinking terrible coffee because she was too exhausted to make it properly, and thought, "This is insane. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a 53-year-old woman who sells fabric. I don't know anything about raising children." But then she heard it. From the other room, A small sound. Quito was singing, quietly off-key, a lullaby in a language Melina didn't recognize. And the twins had stopped crying. She peeked around the doorway and saw him there, leaning over the drawer, his hand gently patting one baby's back while he sang to both of them. And she thought, maybe none of us know what we're doing. Maybe we just love them and figure it out as we go. The next few days were a blur of learning. Melina took time off from her shop, something she'd never done, not in all her years of working. She went to the market and bought diapers, formula bottles, baby clothes. She asked the other women questions, enduring their curious stares and whispered conversations. Who are these children? They asked. Family, Melina answered, which was true even if not in the way they assumed. Some women offered advice kindly. Others looked at her with suspicion. A few turned away entirely, as if poverty and need might be contagious. Melina learned quickly who her real neighbors were. Not the ones who lived closest, but the ones whose hearts had room for complicated stories and messy compassion. At home, Quito was transforming. With food in his belly and sleep in his bones, he was beginning to look like what he actually was, a child. He laughed sometimes, played with a ball Melina had found in her storage closet, helped with the babies with increasing confidence. But Melina noticed other things too. The way he startled at loud noises, the nightmares that made him cry out in his sleep, the way his eyes would go distant sometimes, as if he was back on that roadside, alone and hopeless. Trauma doesn't disappear just because circumstances improve. Melina was learning that. You can't simply love the pain away, but you can create a safe space for healing to happen slowly, in its own time. She would sit with Quito in those difficult moments, not saying much, just being present, letting him know through her quiet steadiness that he didn't have to be strong all the time, that it was okay to be 11 years old and scared and sad about everything he'd lost. Do you think my father will come looking for us? He asked one evening. Melina's blood ran cold at the thought. I don't know, she answered honestly. But if he does, I'll be here. You're not facing anything alone anymore. Do you understand? Quito nodded, but she could see the fear hadn't left his eyes. That fear would prove to be justified. But that storm was still coming. For now they had these precious days of learning to be a family, of building something fragile and beautiful out of the broken pieces they'd each brought to this unexpected home. Here at Tales by RM, we believe every story of courage deserves to be told. Old stories, new voices, and the truth that sometimes the family you choose is the one that saves you. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of settling into routines that felt both strange and right. The twins were thriving, gaining weight, their eyes growing brighter, their cries stronger and more demanding. Melina had named them with Quito's permission. The girl became Amara, meaning grace, and the boy became Jabari, meaning brave one. Names that spoke of who they were becoming, not where they'd come from. Quito had started to smile more. Real smiles that reached his eyes. He'd taken to helping Melina in ways that broke her heart with their sweetness. Folding laundry, washing bottles, singing to the twins when they fussed. He was still carrying too much responsibility for a child his age, but now he was carrying it alongside someone else. And that made all the difference. Melina had reopened her shop, but with shorter hours. She'd bring Quito and the twins with her sometimes, setting up a small area in the back where they could play and sleep. Her customers would peek at them curiously. Some would smile and offer kind words. Others would whisper to each other when they thought she couldn't hear. Where did they come from? She's not married, is she? Those aren't her children. They can't be. What kind of woman takes in strays like that? The judgment stung. Not because Melina cared what they thought of her. She'd lived too long and seen too much to need the approval of people whose compassion had clear boundaries, but because she worried about how it would affect the children. Especially Quito, who was old enough to understand the whispers, old enough to know that the world had already decided he and his siblings were somehow less deserving of love. But there were kind voices too. Mrs. Adeyemi, who ran the vegetable stand, started bringing by extra food. For the little ones, she'd say, pressing packages into Melina's hands. Growing children need good food. Mr. Okonkwo, the elderly tailor, gave Melina fabric scraps to make clothes for the babies. Don't you dare try to pay me, he'd insist. Some things aren't about money. And young Zuri, a teacher at the village school, stopped by one afternoon with books and toys. For when the boy is ready, she said, looking at Quito with warm eyes. Every child deserves an education. These small kindnesses were like patches of light in a shadowy world. They reminded Melina that goodness existed, even when it was quieter than judgment, even when it didn't announce itself as loudly as cruelty. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon that had started like any other, the storm arrived. Melina was in her shop, the twins napping in their carrier, Quito reading a book that Zuri had brought, when the door opened. A man walked in. He was tall, disheveled, with the kind of face that spoke of hard living and harder choices. His eyes swept the room until they landed on Quito. The boy's face went white. The book fell from his hands. "Father," he whispered. The word hung in the air like a curse. Melina's body moved on instinct, positioning herself between this man and the children. Her heart was hammering, but her voice came out steady. "Can I help you?" The man's eyes were bloodshot, his breath already carrying the sour smell of alcohol even though it was barely past noon. "Those are my children," he said, pointing at the twins. "And that's my son. I've come to take them home." "Home?" Melina's voice was quiet but sharp. "The home you drove them from? The home where a boy had to run away in the middle of the night to save his siblings from your neglect." The man's face darkened. "You don't know anything about it. You don't know what it's like." "I know exactly what it's like," Melina interrupted. "I know what it's like to be alone, to feel abandoned, to believe the world has decided you're not worth caring about. But here's what I also know. These children are not going back with you. They're mine." His voice rose aggressive now. "By law they're mine. You can't just steal someone's children." "Steal?" Melina's laugh was bitter. "You threw them away." Quito walked for miles with 2 infants in his arms because staying with you meant death. "Don't talk to me about theft when you abandoned your own flesh and blood." Behind her, she could hear Quito's ragged breathing. The twins were starting to stir, sensing the tension in the air. Melina wanted to turn around to comfort them, but she couldn't take her eyes off this man who represented everything she'd been trying to protect them from. "I've had a hard time," the man said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice now. "Since their mother died, I couldn't think straight. I made mistakes. But I'm ready now. I'm ready to be their father." "Are you sober?" Melina asked bluntly. The man's face flushed with anger. "That's none of your—" "Are you sober?" she repeated. "Right now in this moment, are you sober? Because I can smell the alcohol from here." The silence was answer enough. Melina took a deep breath. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. You're going to get yourself together, really together, not just for a day or a week but for good. You're going to find work, find housing, prove that you can take care of yourself. And then maybe then we can talk about what's best for these children. You have no right." "I have every right." Melina's voice cracked like thunder. "I have the right that comes from being here. From feeding them when they were starving. From holding them when they cried. From giving them a safe place to sleep. Where were you? Where were you when your son was begging on roadsides? Where were you when these babies were dying of hunger?" The man's hands clenched into fists. For a terrible moment, Melina thought he might become violent. She saw Quito move behind her, saw him pick up something. Maybe to defend her, this child ready to protect the woman who protected him, and her heart broke and swelled at the same time. But the man didn't strike. Instead, something in him seemed to crumble. His shoulders sagged. His eyes filled with tears that might have been genuine or might have been manipulation. Melina had seen enough of life to know that sometimes it was both. "They were supposed to die with her," he said quietly. "Their mother. When she died, I thought they should have died too. Less painful that way. For everyone." The casual cruelty of it took Melina's breath away. To look at your newborn children and wish them dead. To decide that death was preferable to the inconvenience of love. "Get out," she said, and her voice was ice. "Get out of my shop. Get out of our lives. And don't come back until you've become someone worthy of these children. If that day ever comes." The man stared at her, at the children, at the life he'd thrown away standing right in front of him, being loved by a stranger who'd shown more parenthood in 3 weeks than he'd managed in his son's entire lifetime. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that felt like the end of the world and the beginning of something new all at once. Melina's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and fear and fury. Quito was there in an instant, his thin arms wrapping around her. This child comforting the adult who was supposed to be strong for him. "Thank you," he whispered into her shoulder. "Thank you for not letting him take us." The twins were crying now, sensing the distress. Melina pulled herself together because that's what you do when children need you. You pull yourself together, and gathered them all close. All 3 of them. Her children. Not by blood, not by law, but by every measure that actually mattered. "He can't have you," she murmured. "None of you. You're mine now, and I'm yours. And no one is going to take that away." She meant it. But even as she said the words, she knew the battle was far from over. The man had rights, legally speaking. Rights that Melina didn't have. And if he chose to pursue them, if he went to the authorities, there would be questions. Investigations. The potential for these children to be ripped from the only safe home they'd ever known. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Melina sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't drink and faced the reality of her situation. She needed to protect these children legally. She needed to become their guardian in the eyes of the law, not just in the reality of their daily lives. She thought about going to the authorities herself. But what would she say? That she'd found a boy and 2 babies on the roadside and decided to keep them? That their father had shown up drunk, claiming his children, and she'd refused? It sounded insane. It sounded like exactly the kind of situation that would result in the children being taken away and placed in some institution while the adults sorted out their competing claims. No. She needed another way. The next morning, Melina closed her shop and went to see Zuri, the young teacher who'd been kind to them. Zuri listened to the whole story, the finding, the father, the fear, with growing horror and admiration. "You need a lawyer," Zuri said immediately. "My uncle. He handles family law. He's expensive, but—" "I don't care about the cost," Melina interrupted. "These children are worth everything I have." And she meant it. Her savings. Her shop. Her house if necessary. What good was any of it if she couldn't use it to protect the people she loved? Zuri made a call. Within 2 days, Melina was sitting in a small office across from a man named Mr. Bakery, who listened to her story with the kind of careful attention that made her feel, for the first time, like maybe this was possible. Maybe she could actually do this. "It won't be easy," he warned. "The father has legal rights. But he also has a history of neglect that can be documented. The boy's testimony will be crucial. And the fact that you've been caring for the children, that matters. Courts want to see stability, safety, love. You can provide all of that. So we have a chance?" Mr. Bakery smiled. "More than a chance. But you need to be prepared for this to get harder before it gets better. The father might fight back. The community might judge. There will be questions about your marital status, your age, your means. You'll have to prove again and again that you're worthy of these children." Melina thought about Quito's smile when he played with his siblings. About Amara's laugh when she was tickled. About Jabari's grip on her finger when she fed him. About the way her house had transformed from a place of lonely silence into a home full of noise and chaos and purpose. "I'm ready," she said. "Whatever it takes." At Tales by RM, we know that the fiercest love is the love that chooses to fight. Old stories with new voices, reminding us that family is built by those brave enough to stand in the gap. The legal process was everything Mr. Bakery had warned it would be. Paperwork that seemed endless. Court dates that kept getting postponed. Social workers who came to inspect Melina's home, who interviewed Quito with questions that made him shake with anxiety, who measured and evaluated and assessed whether love could be quantified on their official forms. Through it all, Melina held steady. She showed them her modest but clean home. She demonstrated how she'd rearranged her life around the children. The crib she'd bought, the high chair positioned in her kitchen, the corner of her shop transformed into a safe play area. She presented bank statements showing she could provide financially. Character references from neighbors who'd witnessed her dedication. But the thing that mattered most couldn't be captured in documents or measurements. It was the way Amara's face lit up when Melina walked into a room. The way Jabari would only settle down for sleep when he could hear her voice humming. The way Quito had started calling her Mama Melina. Not Mama. Not yet, but that small addition of Mama to her name felt like the most precious gift she'd ever received. The father showed up twice more during those months. Once sober, dressed in clean clothes, promising he'd changed. He sat in Mr. Bakery's office and talked about wanting another chance, about the rights of a father, about how blood should matter more than the love of strangers. Melina sat across from him and saw through every word. She'd learned to recognize the difference between genuine transformation and temporary performance. He was saying what he thought people wanted to hear. But his eyes still held that same resentment. That same belief that his children were burdens he'd been unfairly forced to carry. If you truly loved them, Melina said quietly, you would want what's best for them, not what makes you look better, not what salvages your pride. What's actually best for 3 children who've already suffered more than any child should? The second time he appeared, he was drunk again, angry, making threats. Mr. Bakery had him removed by security, and that incident became part of the legal record. Evidence of instability. Evidence that Quito's story wasn't exaggeration, it was survival. During this time, something unexpected happened in the village. The whispers didn't stop, they never truly stopped, but they began to change. People watched Melina. They watched how she juggled her shop and her children. They watched how Quito was flourishing, how he'd started attending school with Zuri as his teacher. They watched how the twins were growing fat and healthy and loved. And some of them, not all but some, began to see what Melina had seen on that roadside months ago. They began to see value where they'd previously seen only burden. They began to understand that family wasn't about bloodlines and legal documents. It was about showing up. Day after day. In the hard moments and the beautiful ones. Mrs. Adeyemi started a collection at the market. For Melina's children, she called them now. People contributed what they could, food, clothes, small amounts of money. Not everyone. Some still turned away, still believed that what Melina was doing was somehow wrong or unnatural. But enough contributed that Melina would sometimes open her door to find bags of groceries on her doorstep. Anonymous gifts from neighbors who wanted to help but weren't quite brave enough to do it publicly. Mr. Okonkwo made clothes for the children. Beautiful little outfits that Melina could never have afforded. Every child should have something that makes them feel special, he said, waving away her thanks. Young Zuri became a regular presence in their lives. She tutored Quito, helped with the twins, became something like an older sister to all of them. I always wanted a big family, she told Melina one evening. I think maybe we're making one together. Not traditional but real. And perhaps that was the most radical thing about what was happening. This unlikely collection of people. A fabric vendor, an orphan boy, 2 abandoned babies, a young teacher, elderly neighbors, market vendors, were creating something that looked nothing like the families in picture books but felt more genuine than many traditional households Melina had known. They were proving that community wasn't something you were born into. It was something you built person by person, act of kindness by act of kindness, until you looked around one day and realized you'd created a net strong enough to catch the falling. 6 months after that day on the roadside, Melina stood in a courthouse with Quito beside her, the twins in a double stroller that Mrs. Adeyemi had given them, and Mr. Bakery presenting their case to a judge who'd heard 1,000 stories of broken families but maybe, just maybe, hadn't heard one quite like this. The father was there too. Court-appointed lawyer at his side. Still trying, even now, to claim ownership of children he'd never wanted. The judge was an older woman with sharp eyes and a face that revealed nothing. She listened to both sides. Asked questions. Requested to speak with Quito privately in her chambers. Those 15 minutes felt like 15 years. Melina waited in the hallway, pacing, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, but was willing to try believing in if it would help. Zuri held Amara. Mrs. Adeyemi held Jabari. Mr. Okonkwo stood nearby, his presence a quiet support. When Quito emerged from the judge's chambers, his eyes were red from crying, but there was something else there too. Something like relief. The judge called them all back in. Sat down. Looked from the father to Melina to the children. And when she spoke, Her voice carried the weight of a decision that would determine 3 young lives. I've seen many cases in my years on this bench, she began. Cases where parents fight over children they want. Cases where children are shuttled between homes like property. Cases where the law and love are in conflict. Melina held her breath. This case is different, the judge continued, because it's not about 2 parents fighting for custody. It's about children who've already chosen. Children who've shown me, through their behavior and their bonds, where they feel safe, where they feel loved, where they've begun to heal from trauma that should never have happened. She turned to the father. Sir, you have legal rights as a biological parent, but you forfeited your moral rights the moment you forced your son to flee with his infant siblings to save their lives. You can petition for supervised visitation once you've completed rehabilitation and maintained sobriety for a minimum of 1 year. But these children will not be returning to your custody. The man's face contorted. He started to stand to object, but his lawyer placed a hand on his arm. Sometimes even lawyers know when the battle is lost. The judge turned to Melina. Ms. Melina, I'm granting you temporary guardianship of all 3 children, with a path to permanent adoption pending completion of the standard waiting period and continued evaluation. The court finds that you have demonstrated not only the capacity to care for these children, but the commitment to love them through their healing. Melina's knees buckled. If Mr. Okonkwo hadn't been there to catch her arm, she might have fallen. The words echoed in her head. Temporary guardianship. Path to permanent adoption. They were hers. Legally now, not just in her heart. The children were hers. Kito threw his arms around her waist, sobbing. The twins, too young to understand the significance but sensing the emotion, began to fuss. And Melina, 53-year-old Melina, who thought her life was already written, who'd believed her story had reached its quiet, lonely conclusion, felt something crack open inside her chest. Joy. Pure, overwhelming, impossible joy. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the village, the way word always does in small places, and people had come, some to support, some just to witness. Some, Melina suspected, still hoping she'd fail so they could feel justified in their judgment. But when they emerged, when people saw Kito holding Melina's hand and the twins in their stroller, and the tears streaming down all their faces, something shifted. Even the hardest hearts had to acknowledge what they were seeing. This was a family. Unconventional. Unexpected. Created from disaster and desperation, and a woman who'd been brave enough to stop her car on a dusty roadside. But a family nonetheless. Mrs. Adeyemi stepped forward first. She pulled Melina into a hug that smelled like vegetables and sunshine. You did it, she whispered. You saved them. We saved each other, Melina whispered back. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? She'd saved 3 children from abandonment and starvation. But they'd saved her too. From a life half-lived. From loneliness disguised as independence. From the slow fade into insignificance that happens when you stop believing you matter to anyone. They'd given her purpose. They'd given her love. They'd given her a reason to wake up every morning with hope instead of resignation. Mr. Okonkwo shook her hand solemnly. Your mother would be proud, he said. And Melina realized he'd known her mother, decades ago, before Melina had even been born. How many stories were hidden in this village? How many connections invisibly woven between all of them? Zuri was beaming. I told you, she said. I told you love would be enough. But Melina knew better. Love alone hadn't been enough. Love plus courage. Love plus community. Love plus the willingness to fight through bureaucracy and judgment and fear. Love plus action. That's what had been enough. As they walked back to Melina's truck, their truck now really, since it had carried all of them to school and market and home so many times, Kito looked up at her. Mama Melina? He said quietly. Yes, my heart. Can I just call you Mama now? Without the Melina part. Melina stopped walking. Knelt down so she was eye level with this boy who'd survived so much. Kito, that would make me happier than anything in the world. He smiled. A real smile. The kind that children give when they finally feel safe enough to be children again. Okay. Mama. Such a small word. Such an enormous meaning. This is Tales by RM, where old stories find new voices. where we remember that the greatest adventures aren't always journeys to distant places. Sometimes they're the courage to love when loving feels impossible. Stay with us. This story isn't over yet. Life after the courthouse didn't suddenly become easy. That's not how healing works. That's not how family works, especially families built from fragments of trauma and survival. But it became possible. And possibility, real tangible possibility, was something none of them had dared to hope for before. Quito thrived in school. Zuri reported that he was hungry for knowledge in the way only children who've been denied things can be. He absorbed everything, reading mathematics, science, history. But more than academics, he was learning how to be a child again. How to play without constantly watching over his shoulder. How to laugh without guilt. How to trust that tomorrow would come and he'd still be safe. The nightmares didn't disappear overnight. Some nights Melina would wake to hear him crying in his room, trapped in memories of those desperate weeks on the road. She'd go to him, sit on the edge of his bed, and sometimes they'd talk. Sometimes they'd just sit in silence. Sometimes silence was enough. "I dream about the roadside," he told her once. "I dream that you drive past, that you don't stop, that everyone just keeps driving and we die there under that tree." Melina's throat tightened. "But I did stop," she said softly. "And you didn't die. You're here. You're safe. And every morning when you wake up, that's the truth. Not the nightmare. This, he repeated like a prayer, like an affirmation, like a promise he was learning to believe. The twins grew impossibly fast the way babies do. Amara walked first, tottering around the house with the fearless determination of someone who'd survived too much to be afraid of falling. Jabari followed weeks later, more cautious but equally persistent. Their first words were variations of mama, the universal syllable that meant safety, that meant love, that meant the person who showed up every single time they called. They would never remember their father, would never remember those first terrible weeks of their lives. For them, their story began with Melina. She was mother and father and everything in between. And maybe that was a mercy. Maybe some things are better forgotten. But Quito remembered. And Melina knew that was both a burden and a gift. He remembered what they'd survived. He remembered his own courage. And as he grew older, 12, 13, 14, that memory became a foundation. He knew what he was capable of. He knew that when the world said children were powerless, he'd proven otherwise. Melina's house transformed. What had been a quiet space designed for solitude became loud and chaotic and utterly alive. Toys scattered across floors. Children's drawings covering the refrigerator. The smell of cooking food at all hours because someone was always hungry. The sound of laughter echoing off walls that had been silent for so long they'd forgotten what joy sounded like. She sold her shop eventually. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She realized she'd spent years selling fabric to other people so they could make things, while her own life remained unmade. She used the money to expand her home, adding rooms, creating a proper bedroom for each child, building a garden where they could play safely. And then she did something unexpected. Something that started almost by accident but grew into something much larger. Other mothers in the village, struggling mothers, started coming to her for advice. How do you manage when money is tight? How do you help a child who's experienced trauma? How do you create stability when the world feels chaotic? Melina would invite them in, make tea, listen to their stories, share what she'd learned, not as an expert because she'd never claimed to be that, but as someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side still standing. Her home became a gathering place. Women supporting women. Mothers helping mothers. And sometimes, inevitably, there would be a knock on the door and someone would be standing there with a child. A niece whose parents had died, a neighbor's son being abused, a baby found abandoned. "Could you?" they'd ask. "Just for a few days. Until we figure something out." And Melina would open her door. Because once you've learned to see the abandoned, you can't unsee them. Once you've felt what it means to be someone's last hope, you can't turn away. Within 3 years, Melina's home had sheltered 17 children. Not all permanently. Some stayed for days. Some for months. A few, like Quito and the twins, became permanent fixtures. Her house became known throughout the region, not officially, not legally, but in the way that matters most. It became known as the place that would take you in. The place where love had no maximum capacity. The place where there's no room was never an answer. The authorities noticed eventually. Social services came, initially concerned about unlicensed foster care, about proper procedures, about all the rules and regulations that exist to protect children but sometimes end up protecting bureaucracy instead. But what they found was a home. A real home. Clean, safe, filled with laughter and learning and children who were thriving. They found Zuri, now a regular volunteer, teaching lessons in the living room. They found Mrs. Adeyemi delivering fresh vegetables. They found Mr. Okonkwo teaching the older children to sew. They found a community that had rallied around this unlikely woman and her growing family. The head of social services was a pragmatic woman named Mrs. Kayamaka. She sat in Melina's kitchen watching the controlled chaos of dinner preparation, older children helping younger ones, Kito now 15 and teaching a newer arrival how to set the table, the twins racing around speaking a mile a minute in that way 10-year-olds do. "This is highly irregular," Mrs. Kayamaka said. "I know," Melina replied calmly. "You're not following proper foster care protocols. I know that too. You could get in serious trouble." Melina set down her wooden spoon and looked Mrs. Kayamaka directly in the eye. "I could. Or you could help me do this the right way. Help me become licensed. Help me turn what I'm already doing into something official. Because those children out there, most of them had nowhere else to go. And if following your protocols means turning them away, then I'll take the trouble. Every time." There was a long silence. Mrs. Kayamaka looked around the kitchen, at the drawings on the walls, at the chore chart where everyone had responsibilities, at the herb garden visible through the window, carefully tended by children learning that growing things requires patience and care. Finally, she smiled. "I'll send someone next week to start the licensing process. You'll need to make some modifications, add safety features, complete training. But if you're willing to do it properly—" "I am," Melina said immediately. "Then let's make this official." The journey to becoming a licensed foster home took 18 months. Inspections, training sessions, background checks, interviews, more paperwork than Melina had seen in her entire life combined. But she did it all. With Zuri's help. With Mr. Bakery providing legal guidance. With Mrs. Adeyemi and Mr. Okonkwo and dozens of neighbors, who'd become not just a community but a family of choice. And Kito, now 16, tall and strong and impossibly wise for his age, became her right hand. He understood what it meant to be scared and alone. He could talk to the new children in ways Melina couldn't, because he'd been them. He was living proof that survival was possible, that healing was real, that the worst beginning didn't determine your ending. "You saved me," he told Melina one evening, as they washed dishes together after dinner. "We saved each other," she replied, the same words she'd spoken years ago outside the courthouse. "No." His voice was firm. "You saved me first. On that roadside. You could have driven past. Everyone else did. But you stopped. You chose to see me. And that choice—" He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "That choice changed everything. Not just for me. For all of them." He gestured toward the living room where 7 children of various ages were sprawled, doing homework, playing games, simply existing in the safety they'd never known before. "So now," Kito continued, "I choose to see them too, the way you saw me. And maybe someday they'll see someone else. And it'll just keep going. This thing you started. I don't even know what to call it." "Love," Melina said simply. "It's called love." On the 10-year anniversary of the day Melina found Kito and the twins on that roadside, she stood in her garden watching the controlled chaos of a house full of children. Kito was 21 now, studying social work at university but still living at home, still helping. The twins, Amara and Jabari, were 13, vibrant and healthy and completely unaware of how close they'd come to not existing at all. There were 8 other children currently in her care. Some would stay. Some would eventually reunify with family members who'd gotten their lives together. Some would age out and move on to their own adventures. But all of them, every single one, would carry with them the knowledge that someone had chosen them, that they'd been worth stopping for. The village had changed too. Other families, inspired by Melina's example, had opened their homes. Not everyone. The world still had plenty of people who looked away, who decided that compassion had limits, who believed that some children were worth saving and others weren't. But enough had changed. Enough hearts had softened. Enough people had learned that family wasn't about biology or tradition or fitting into neat categories. It was about showing up. It was about choosing again and again to love even when love was inconvenient or complicated or scary. Mrs. Adeyemi had passed away the year before, but not before seeing the garden she'd helped create flourish. Mr. Okonkwo was slowing down, his hands too arthritic for detailed sewing, but he still came by weekly to tell stories to the children. Zuri had gotten married and had children of her own, but remained Melina's closest friend and confidant. And Melina herself? She was 63 years old now. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her hands were more weathered than ever. Her back ached in the mornings from years of lifting babies and chasing toddlers and carrying the physical weight of love. But she'd never been happier. Because happiness, she'd learned, wasn't the absence of struggle. It wasn't a perfectly curated life or a story with neat beginnings and endings. Happiness was the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of being needed, of mattering, of knowing that your life had become a bridge for others to cross from darkness into light. That evening, after the younger children were in bed, Kito found Melina sitting on her porch watching the stars. He sat beside her in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who've been through war together and survived. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "That day on the roadside? Do you ever wish you'd just driven past?" Melina didn't answer immediately. She thought about the life she'd had before. The quiet, the simplicity, the loneliness disguised as peace. Then she thought about Kito's first real laugh, weeks after she'd brought him home. About Amara's tiny hand wrapped around her finger. About Jabari's first steps. About every child who'd walked through her door afraid and walked out believing, even just a little, that the world might have room for them after all. "Not once," she said finally. "Not for a single second." Kito nodded. They sat together as the night deepened, as stars multiplied across the sky, as somewhere in the house a child cried out in sleep and another voice, one of the older children, murmured comfort. "I'm going to do this too," Kito said. "When I finish school, I'm going to create a home like this, maybe even bigger, because you showed me it was possible." Melina reached over and squeezed his hand. "You already are doing it. Every time you help with the younger ones, every time you share your story, every time you prove that the abandoned can become the rescuers, you're already doing it." There's a proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child. But Melina had learned something deeper. Sometimes it takes a child, or 3 children found on a desperate roadside, to raise a village, to teach it what love looks like when it's stripped of conditions and expectations, and all the neat boxes society tries to put it in. Her life had been ordinary once, predictable, safe in its smallness, and then she'd stopped her car. One decision, one moment, one act of seeing what everyone else had chosen to ignore. That's all it took to change everything. Because here's what Melina understood now, after 10 years of living it. Love isn't a finite resource. It doesn't run out when you share it. It multiplies. It grows. It becomes something bigger than any individual heart could contain. When you love one abandoned child, you create ripples. They grow and heal and eventually love others. Those others do the same. And on it goes, this beautiful multiplication of compassion, until you look around one day and realize you didn't just change one life. You changed the world. Maybe not the whole world. Maybe just your corner of it. But for the children sleeping safely in their beds tonight, children who might not have survived without someone choosing to stop, that corner is everything. Melina sat on her porch until the night grew cold. Kito had gone inside, but she lingered, thinking about that dusty roadside. About a boy holding 2 babies under a withered tree. About the woman she'd been, lonely, resigned, half alive, and the woman she'd become. She thought about all the people who'd driven past that day, busy with their own lives, their own concerns. Not cruel, just not looking, not seeing, not stopping. And she thought, what if I hadn't stopped? What if I'd been 5 minutes earlier or later? What if I'd been too tired, too busy, too scared? But she had stopped, and that had made all the difference. Not just for 3 children on a roadside, but for 17 children who'd since found safety in her home. For a village that had learned compassion could be contagious. For neighbors who discovered that helping others didn't diminish them, it expanded them. For a young man named Kito who would spend his life paying forward the love he'd been shown. For Melina herself, who'd learned that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. She stood up, her old bones protesting, and walked inside. Past the living room where evidence of child life scattered everywhere. Past the wall of photos, dozens of faces, some still here, some moved on, all loved. Past the kitchen where tomorrow's breakfast would be made. Where hungry children would gather. Where life would continue in all its messy, beautiful, impossible glory. She stopped at each bedroom door. Looked in at sleeping children. Pulled up a kicked-off blanket. Moved a stuffed animal closer to a searching hand. Whispered prayers over each head, for safety, for healing, for futures bright enough to outshine their pasts. In the last room she found Kito still awake, reading by lamplight. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He looked up and smiled. "Just thinking about that roadside. About how different everything could have been." "But wasn't," Melina said. "But wasn't," he agreed. She kissed his forehead the way she had when he was 11 and newly hers. "Good night, my heart." "Good night, Mama." Melina walked to her own room. The last 10 years written in the laugh lines around her eyes, in the gray of her hair, in the deep satisfaction of a life fully lived. She climbed into bed, and just before sleep took her she smiled. Because somewhere out there, on some roadside, in some moment of desperation, there was probably another child waiting. Another person driving past. Another chance for someone to stop. And maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't. But Melina had learned that you can't save everyone. You can only save the ones in front of you. The ones your heart recognizes. The ones who become yours not through biology but through that mysterious alchemy of courage and compassion and choosing love when fear would be easier. She'd saved 3. And they'd saved her. And together they created something that would outlive them all. A legacy of love without limits, of family without boundaries, of the radical notion that every child deserves someone who will stop. Someone who will see them. Someone who will choose them. Every single time. This has been Tales by RM, where we take old stories and give them new voices. Because these stories, these truths about courage and compassion, and the families we build from broken pieces, they never get old. They just keep multiplying like love itself, reaching places where once there was only abandonment. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that one person can make a difference, that one moment of courage can change everything, then maybe you're the one who will stop next time. Maybe you're the one who will see what others drive past. Maybe you're the next chapter in this never-ending story of how love saves the world, one roadside at a time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And remember, old stories, new voices, but the same eternal truth. Love multiplies when you give it away. This is Tales by RM. Until next time, may you have the courage to stop when stopping matters most.